call it curb stomping. Ah! No. Rhymes with growth!
I feel like Greek mythology is a sort of gateway for most people to get into learning about mythology in general. We have a lot of written down stories from this mythology that span centuries, and for a long time it was the main one that got referenced in the wider pop culture. Through things like kids' books, Disney's Hercules, Clash of the Titans, Class of the Titans, the original God of War games, and for me, through the Percy Jackson books. To be clear, it wasn't like other mythologies were never used in pop culture. Thor from Marvel or Goku being based on Sun Wukong are good examples that come to mind. And today, most other mythologies get enough spotlight to be popular in their own right, but I still think Greek mythology is the most popular one. Which for Stargate is kind of weird, as it almost never uses elements from Greek mythology. Now, in case you're a mythology fan who clicked on this video and don't know anything about Stargate, originally it was a movie that later got a TV show spin-off. The premise of the franchise is that Ancient Aliens was correct. Long ago, aliens visited our ancestors and influenced our ancient history and mythology.
This is Thor.
Greetings.
I know people today frown on the Ancient Aliens theory, rightfully so, because a lot of it was based on not good ideas. Stargate itself is not like that, at least not intentionally, in part because every culture was influenced by the Ancient Aliens. The main ones the heroes of the show deal with are the Goa'uld, a race of snake-like parasites that take over the body of their host. When they arrived on Earth, they co-opted or established themselves as the gods of this primitive race, taking them as hosts and enslaving them, spreading them throughout the galaxy with use of a device called, well, the Stargate. I'm sorry if this is a review for the Stargate fans watching, but again, I'm establishing this for the sake of mythology fans who might have clicked on this video because of the Greek gods in the title. Now, Stargate not focusing on Greek mythology does make some sense. The original movie focused on Egyptian mythology, and in universe, the Supreme System Lord Ra ruled over the others. It makes sense that Ra and other gods associated with the Egyptian pantheon would be given center stage, such as Osiris, Hathor, Hera-Ur, Apophis, Sokar, and Anubis. But SG-1 established that the Goa'uld had been part of other pantheons, such as Celtic, Indian, Japanese, Chinese, and the Greeks. But for the Greek pantheon, who is the main representative? Kronos. Which is kind of odd given Kronos' story in mythology ends when his children, the Olympians, overthrowing him. What makes this even more odd is Stargate has two story arcs about ancient Goa'uld who were once overthrown and their attempt to return to power. And I don't know, it just seems like that's a role Kronos is fit to have. It's pretty much the main role he has in almost every piece of fiction today.
Your survival is the key to my return.
And again, he's kind of the sole representation of the Greek gods in SG-1. We do hear about some other Goa'uld associated with the Greek pantheon, but we only ever see one of these Goa'uld in person, Athena. That was after the Empire collapsed and most of the other gods were killed off.
False god. Dead false god.
To be clear, I'm not saying this makes SG-1 bad for not using Greek mythology. Again, they have a very good reason. But you have to admit, it's weird for SG-1 to establish the Goa'uld, who were petty, abusive, and power-hungry beings, have been part of almost every pantheon on Earth, yet all those traits which can be easily applied to the Greek gods, but we almost never see any of the other major Greek gods. Unfortunately, I can't give you a behind-the-scenes reason why the writers chose not to use gods like Zeus or Poseidon. As far as I can tell, no one has asked this question to any of the writers, or they've never given an answer. But what I can try and do is give you an in-universe explanation to the question, where are the Greek gods in Stargate? Specifically, I'm going to focus on the main 12 Olympians. The extended materials do make references to some of the more minor mythological beings, such as Heracles, Perseus, Medusa, Eris, Hecate, and Paris of Troy. But not much on them besides, oh, they were Goa'uld too. Maybe if this video does well enough, I'll make a sequel looking at some of these guys too. Some of the information I'm going to pull comes from the extended materials, the comics, books, RPGs, etc. These aren't strictly canon with the shows, so you kind of have to take them with a grain of salt. On that note, I'm breaking up this video a little differently than how I normally do. Normally I cover the entire lore, both the shows and the extended media, in one section. But this time I'm going to break the video up into two sections, one for the show's lore and one for the extended media's lore, just to show how little we have to work with the shows. Starting off, like I said, Kronos is the main Goa'uld we see associated with the Greek pantheon. And this is a rare case where I can pull a clip that explains the character's backstory in its entirety.
Kronos was among the earliest Greek gods, one of 12 titans who eventually ascended to supreme domination. He was god of fate and eventually became father to Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, and Hades.
And okay.
Yeah, that's pretty much it for Kronos' backstory relevant to mythology. He does have more backstory, but it's only relevant to events if you watch the show. For example, he killed Teal'c's father, which put Teal'c on the path to want freedom for the Jaffa, which again is fine and all, but has little to do with mythology. Which I feel like is going to become a theme here. We get some big stroke connections to mythology, but details are never talked about. For example, Daniel talked about Kronos being one of 12 other titans, but we never hear about the other titans, and no, Earth naming its warship the Prometheus does not count. And that clip I played is the only time we ever hear anything about the Elder Olympians. Also, I guess just Demeter and Hestia. I have no idea why those two were excluded. Though there is an interesting note here about Hades. He was the last god Daniel listed off, which he follows up by saying this.
Now, this last relationship may indicate a connection to the Goa'uld Sokar.
I'll have a point on this at the end, which will also apply to Aphrodite, so I'm not forgetting her. She is mentioned, but very briefly, and again, part of a point I'll make at the end. Actually, on that note of Greek gods we hear about but didn't see, let's look at Pelops. I know I said I was only going to focus on the big 12, and not only is Pelops not an Olympian, he's also not a god. In mythology, he is most known as the son of Tantalus, and in some versions, he's the person that Tantalus killed and served to the gods as food. If he was the one killed, he was revived and later went on to found the house of Atreus. No, not him. But Pelops is interesting because I did look him up and he did have a real-world cult dedicated to him. And as Baal once said,
I suppose all you need is enough people to worship you, and then what's the difference? You're pretty much a god by definition, are you not?
touche, Stargate. Touche. I do want to talk about Pelops for another reason. He kind of represents a lot of oddities in how Stargate handles some of the mythologies it deals with. In the episode A Brief Candle, he conducted an experiment on humans. He infected them with nanites that accelerated their aging, making them live at most 1 to 2 months. The thing is, this premise really has nothing to do with Pelops from a mythology standpoint. Like, props to the statue they made in the episode, him riding a chariot with winged horses. That is part of the myths, but his placement in the story just feels random. I don't want to give the writers too much crap over this. This was a season 1 episode. I'm going to be fair and assume they didn't have time to plan all this out. Like, I assume they wanted to tell a story and just picked a name out of the hat or whatever was the closest. I wouldn't expect them to sit down and spend hours trying to justify the use of a mythological deity when Stargate doesn't need to try and be accurate to the myths. But you have to admit, it's weird we know more about Pelops, who got extended lore by the way that I won't cover, than gods like Hermes or Dionysus. But tangent aside, let's move on to an actual Olympian, Ares. When the System Lord Baal was taking over the Empire, various System Lords were looking for worlds to escape to. One of them being Ares, the god of war, who was possibly killed in the episode It's Good to Be King, when SG-1 destroyed his ship with a puddle jumper with 2 drone shots.
Great shot, kid. That was 1 in a million.
Finally, we get to Athena, who is a little different from her myth counterpart. In the myths, she's the goddess of wisdom and battle strategies. But in the show, well, she's not dumb, but freely admits that Katesh was smarter than her, to the point that Katesh tricked Athena into thinking she had an ancient treasure, which she didn't, but Athena thought she did and kidnapped her old host to try and find it. And we later learned she was a minor player in Goa'uld politics, who only managed to rise to mid-tier status because she would ally herself with more powerful Goa'uld such as Kronos, Camillus, Stravog, and even Anubis when he was first banished. And that's pretty much all we know about Athena and the rest of the Olympians in the show. Now we move on to extended media, starting off with the Alderac RPGs with Kronos and Zeus. See, the Alderac RPGs actually made Zeus a character with his own backstory. He's very much tied in the history of Cronus, so I'll cover both of them at the same time. Also, due to lack of visuals for Zeus, I'll be using footage from Clash of the Gods. Cronus' rise to power started on Earth. He was originally an underlord to a Goa'uld whose name is lost to time, whom he betrayed. Which is kind of odd because in the myths we know who it was that Kronos took kingship from. Anyway, while he gained the power he sought, he became paranoid that the same thing would happen to him. Which eventually, of course, it did. His son Zeus, along with his fellow broodmates, siblings, and Cronus' queen Rhea, plotted to overthrow the Titans. It's not clear what the relationship between the Titans are in Stargate, if they are siblings like in the myths, or if it is merely an underlord and system lord relationship. Either way, Zeus had a plan: take out the strongest Titan and the rest will follow. And his plan worked. The following battle was destructive, but ended with an Olympian victory. And Zeus's theory was proven true as Cronus' underlords began to fight among themselves rather than unite against the Olympians. The RPG states that life under Cronus' rule was harsh, and people were all too willing to forget about him and turn to this new god, who became just as despotic and corrupt as the old one. While Zeus spent centuries ruling over his dominion, Kronos was not idle. While Ra had forbidden him from returning to Earth, he maintained control over his core world and had taken a stock of human slaves with him when he fled. He tightened control over his world and his underlords. He trusted no one and dispersed swift justice against any perceived wrongdoing in brutal ways. An underlord who he perceived to have attempted a rebellion was slowly killed over the course of 1,000 years. As Kronos grew in power, he sent agents into Zeus's territory to spread dissent and rebellion. With tales of how Zeus overthrew the benevolent Titan, at the same time he grew his fleet for a massive attack. Chaos going on in the Empire at the time gave Kronos the perfect opportunity he needed to get revenge on his upstart son. What made this even better was a coup against Zeus at the same time, with Zeus's Jaffa either dead or turned against him. Zeus's forces were either destroyed or folded into Kronos' empire, and the cherry on top for Kronos was he managed to capture the former god of lightning. He cast him onto Tartarus, a prison world he had shaped to hold his son. For centuries, Zeus would cling to life on the hellish world. Just as it seemed his torment would last forever, SG-1 killed Kronos. In the chaos that followed, Zeus managed to escape with the aid of an unknown benefactor. He returned to his former holdings and began to try and regain his power. But this time it would be much harder. His fellow Olympians were no longer united. In fact, many were dead. At the same time, various other system lords were attempting to take control of what was left of Kronos' territory. That being said, he is growing in power. His fate can be decided in the System Lord plot hooks, an extension of the Living Gods RPG. He's found by an SG team at a party and seems friendly enough, even giving them the coordinates to an evil Goa'uld, who was in fact one of his rivals. Even if the team managed to kill the Goa'uld, Zeus would grow bored of them or see no other use for them and try to have them killed. Later on, the SGC would learn that Zeus was attempting to take control of a world they had formerly cleared of Goa'uld control. But when the team arrives, they discover the natives don't want to be freed from Zeus, believing him to be a benevolent lord who will protect them from the other system lords. The team is given a choice to either leave the natives to their fate with a potentially devious system lord, or find a way to overthrow the god in a way that does not draw the ire of the natives. May I propose my solution to this problem?
Eat my entire ass! That'll do.
Next, we move on to Ares, who was given more backstory in both the RPG and in the Fall of Rome prequel comic. In the RPG, he is the Goa'uld who conquered the homeworld of Machello, an inventor and freedom fighter against the Goa'uld who became the most wanted man in the Empire. He orchestrated the death of Ares' sons Deimos and Phobos when their ships exploded. This enraged Ares, who hunted down Machello for years, even getting the aid of the other system lords. 50 years later, and more than 2 billion people dead, Machello thought he had finally eluded his enemies. However, his wife was captured and implanted with a Goa'uld who helped in Machello's capture. He was brutally tortured, only kept alive through a sarcophagus, but refused to give any information to the Goa'uld. Instead of losing his knowledge, Ares decided to make him the next host for his brother Hephaestus. But Michello managed to escape, spending the rest of his life fighting the Goa'uld till he was over 100 years old. At that point, he meets SG-1 during Holiday and switches bodies with Daniel for a time. Now, Ares did show up in the Stargate comic, The Fall of Rome. Specifically, he shows up in the prequel issue in which SG-1 watches a recording of him laying out the history of his traitor's son, Phobos. Unlike in the RPG, Phobos didn't die in an explosion, but rather wanted to take his father's title as the god of war. Ares crushed his rebellion, in part due to Deimos staying loyal to their father. Phobos fled to the Romans and assumed his father's identity in their pantheon, Mars. Later, the Romans turned on him and he was returned to his father, who, after torturing Phobos, would banish him to a graveyard world. Now, I want to stay focused on the 12 Olympians in this video. Perhaps one day I'll come back and do a follow-up on the Fall of Rome comics and Phobos in general, because honestly, it looks really cool. Finally, we get to the book Sacrifice Moon. The plot of the book is SG-1 is captured while on a mission and sent to a world as tributes. This world was once part of the Helos Confederacy, a group of human worlds who used the Stargate for regular travel and trade between them, until the Goa'uld showed up. It's most likely it was Apollo who conquered the world, since Artemis said he gave it to her. She ruled this world for 1,000 years, and it's an utter hellscape. The other worlds were allowed to maintain their lifestyles, not being slaves, but had to send tributes to the single world Artemis ruled. Tributes would be forced to wear moon collars, devices that would turn people into prey and predators at night. Prey would keep their normal sanity, but predators would not. At night, the collars would drive the predators to madness with the desire to kill prey. I won't go into it, but it can get pretty graphic. If you want to imagine something, think something like the infected from 28 Days Later, but they can use tools and stuff. Artemis did this for entertainment, and the book ends where she is locked in a sarcophagus. She's later mentioned in another book, but it's more just a reference to a past event. Similarly, the book also mentions Poseidon and Hades, but in Poseidon's case, it was more he was associated with a city on Earth, and Hades, it was just more an expression. Like when you say, "Oh God, this is a bad idea." So that was everything I could find on the 12 Olympians, technically 13 because I'm counting both Dionysus and Hestia. Actually, on that note, you might have noticed there's 14 names on screen. I kept noticing this too and spent like 2 days double checking my work and trying to figure out why I have 14 names, and I figured it out. Hades is not a fucking Olympian. I forgot he doesn't rule on Olympus, so technically he doesn't count, which feels messed up. Honestly, every time he started to take power in fiction feels even more justified now. Anyway, getting back to Stargate and the Olympians, what do we know about them? Going by the show, Zeus, Poseidon, Hera, Hades, and Aphrodite were mentioned but not seen. Demeter, Hestia, Hermes, Dionysus, Hephaestus, and Artemis are never brought up. Apollo is kind of weird because there is an Earth ship named the Apollo, but I doubt this was named for the Goa'uld. Ares and Athena were in actual episodes, though Ares was never seen, and I think Athena is the only named Goa'uld left who is not dead. The extended media did give Zeus a more fleshed out backstory, but it also never named any of his siblings or the other Olympians. Ares was also given a more fleshed out backstory or backstories, and the RPG confirmed Hephaestus was around. And of course, Artemis's character and backstory were fleshed out in her book, along with confirmation that Apollo was around. But that's kind of it. Again, it's kind of weird because we know more about Pelops, but nothing for some of the most major deities in Greek mythology. What's with that? Here are some theories. Zeus's backstory in the RPGs gives us an interesting option, that being Kronos killed most of them, and I think this works on a lot of levels. For example, the only Olympians we see or meet come from the second generation. The Olympians can be divided into two groups. The first generation, who fought in the war against the Titans, and the second, those born afterwards. Ares, Athena, Artemis, Apollo, and Hephaestus are part of this second generation we hear about in Stargate. And yes, I know in some tellings of the myths, Ares was present during the Titanomachy, but in most tellings he was not. Here's my theory. What if Zeus and his siblings did overthrow Kronos, but the second generation of Olympians were not present for that war or did not play a large part in it? When Kronos returned for a vengeance and obliterated the Olympians, His ire was directed at those who originally betrayed him.
Thanks to you, Zeus, Hera, and the rest of my dear children, it's payback time.
Yes, I know that clip was from Clash of the Titans, but you can't tell me Kronos in Stargate wouldn't say that. And the others were either diminished or turned to ally with Kronos. In fact, we were told that Athena did ally with Kronos at some point. I kind of wonder if she betrayed the others to Kronos. In mythology, she was part of a coup against Zeus. Anyway, the reason the characters don't really hear about the Olympians is because they don't matter in Goa'uld politics anymore. Daniel said it best once.
Their numbers vary from time to time. New ones rise up, old ones get knocked off. We think there's about a dozen right now.
The only reason the Olympians are still widely known on Earth is that Zeus and the other Olympians were still in power when the rebellion on Earth happened and the Goa'uld lost the planet. Earth was a bit like a time capsule, preserving their importance, but for the rest of the galaxy, time marched on, and in the end, the Titan of Time had the last laugh. Another explanation is syncretism. See, something the Romans and Greeks like to do was look at other religions and compare them to their own. The idea being, oh, you're just worshipping my gods, but differently. An interesting real-world example is some of the earliest accounts we have of the Norse gods coming from the Romans, saying they worship gods like Mercury, Mars, and Heracles, which of course would be Odin, Tyr, and Thor. Remember that point I made earlier about Hades being a connection between Sokar and Kronos? Well, Hades is a god of the underworld, and Stargate took some liberties with Sokar.
Yeah, basically he was the original Satan.
But Sokar is a god associated with the underworld, and the Egyptians would later combine him with Osiris, who the Greeks believed was Hades. What I'm saying here is it's possible there was no Hades. In Stargate's world, Hades was just a name the Greeks gave to Sokar. We do see some examples in the show. The Goa'uld Set, during his exile on Earth, did take another identity, Typhon, which was another real-world connection the Greeks made with the god Set, or Hathor, who is said to be connected with a bunch of other deities.
Hathor. The Greeks identified her with Aphrodite. There's Ishtar of Babylon, Astarte of Syria, Ceres of Rome.
Sounds like she got around.
Yeah.
And again, this is an actual real-world thing, not only in syncretism, but also the study of religions. I recommend Overly Sarcastic Productions' video on Aphrodite, but to sum it up, Aphrodite was an import god based on Astarte, who is based on Ishtar. Though in the Stargate RPGs, Astarte was an underlord to Baal. The best way to work this into the theory is the Goa'uld were not overly concerned about this stuff. I doubt Hathor cared if the Greeks called her Aphrodite, as long as she got her tribute. Another interesting theory I've seen is that the Greek/Roman gods were originally the ancients, since it was said the ancients did help in the founding of Rome, and the story of what happened to Atlantis was passed down to a Greek guy. Probably the best evidence for this was the ancient Janus, since his name is also the name of a Roman god. And I do mean Roman. Janus is a god specific to the Romans and not the Greeks. And this is important to note because as far as I know, there is no ancient that has a Greek god name, which may not sound like a big deal, but consider that there are two Zeuses in Stargate.
What?
The Goa'uld and an Asgard.
What?
Long story short, he comes from the Unexplored Worlds RPG. Due to a battle with the Goa'uld resulting in an issue with his cloning machine, not all his memories went into the new clone body. He crashed onto a world once controlled by Zeus, and after having to fight off a group of them, he's using some kind of hollow generator to hide his true form. The people assume that he must be Zeus, and the Asgard took up the name. I won't go any more into him because it's not relevant, but it's weird we know this, but no info on an ancient named Zeus, right? I'm not trying to discredit the theory or anything, it's just something I noticed. So in the end, here are my final thoughts on what happened to the Olympians. First is that Kronos returned with a vengeance and wiped most of the Pantheon out. Those who survived were reduced in stature and were no longer big players in Goa'uld politics. Second is that a form of syncretism meant that some of these gods might not have been Goa'uld at all, or had shared identities in different cultures. And finally, the original Greek/Roman gods were the ancients. But what do you all think? Do you have your own ideas as to what happened to the Greek gods in Stargate? Or do you agree with one of the ideas I've presented here? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. Leave a like and subscribe. Follow my social medias. And remember,
Your idea of accommodation is pitiful.